Hello, students. In the last episode, we spoke about the era of silent cinema. Today, we are going to speak further about the arrival of talkies as well as the studio era of Indian cinema. Now, the first question which I would like to put forward is whether silent films were completely silent. In silent films, dialogues were often presented through intertitles. On the other hand, silent films were not completely silent, as almost every film had background scores, where many instruments were played in the course of the film. Instruments such as piano, violin, harmonium, tabla, and other musical instruments often accompanied these silent films. The first talkie, or L. Johnson's Jazz Singer, was released as early as 1927. Jazz Singer was released with musical accompaniment, very similar to silent cinema. However, it had 4 singing and talking sequences. On July 1928, the first talkies, or the first all-talking pictures, Lights of New York, was released. Talkies in India led to introduction of sound as well as synchronized dialogues. The silent era had ended, and now one could actually hear actors and actresses talking in films. Talkie Melody of Love was exhibited for the first time by Madan Theatre at Elphinstone Picture Palace in Calcutta as early as 1929. In fact, Elphinstone Picture Palace was one of the first theatre in India with a permanent sound setup. By 1930s, however, many theatres in India were permanently equipped for projecting sound films. On 14th March 1931, first Indian talkie, an all-talking film, that is what is commonly referred as talkies, Alamara, was released by Imperial Film Company. It was the first full-length sound feature film. A love story based between a gypsy girl and a prince. It was based on a Parsi play written by Joseph David. The film was released in Majestic Cinema, Bombay, and was starring stars like Prithviraj Kapoor, Zubeda, Master Vitthal, Zillo, Wazir Muhammad Khan. Now in total it had 7 songs, and the music director was Firoz Shah M. Mistri. The curiosity was irresistible, and the film was a stunning success. Now, according to common press, when the film was first time released in Majestic Cinema in Bombay, police had to be actually called for crowd control. As I said, the curiosity was irresistible for an all-talking picture. Now, in the same year, as many as 22 talkie films were made in several languages in India, that which included Hindi, Bengali, Tamil, and Telugu. Within 3 weeks of the release of Alamara, Madan Theatre released its first Bengali talkie, Jamai Shoshti. Madan followed this up with Shirin Farhad, which was in Hindi. Shirin Farhad was actually an even more successful film than Alamara. Now the film, that is Shirin Farhad, is said to have featured as many as 42 songs. And foreign sound technicians recorded the film on a double system sound. That is, what I mean to say is that a lot of emphasis was paid on the technical quality of the recording. Now, the popularity of talkies made 2 things evident. Number 1, that is, films can now be localized, made in regional languages and for regional communities. So previously we had only the concept of national cinema. But with the arrival of talkies, locally films could be produced for a local community. Secondarily, it made songs an integral part of the narrative of Indian cinema. Moreover, one may also say that it was a rupture in aesthetic of cinema in India. Now, aesthetic of cinema in India, that is in context of early Indian silent cinema, was primarily visual. However, the arrival of talkies also led to incorporation of oral aesthetic. Initially, the question of aesthetics, that is in context of oral aesthetics, remained primarily in purview of the clear recording of sound. That is, how good the recording was, in simple words. The quality and the clarity of the dialogues remained a matter of utmost importance. For example, silent films were recorded at 16 frames per second. However, with the arrival of sound, films started being recorded as 24 frames per second. Slowly, with the arrival of talkies, the oral aesthetics actually took precedence over the visual aesthetics, at least for a period of time. It made India, for one, it made Indian cinema heavily reliant of music, and henceforth, the tradition of song and dances in Indian cinema became extremely popular. Obviously, it came from the already existing song and dance tradition, which was already existing in India. Alamara was in fact a trendsetter. It had, as I mentioned above, seven songs. Shirin Farhad had 42 songs. Indra Sabha, another film by J.J. Madan, had songs ranging from anything between 42 to 69. So, as a common practice, what exactly happened is 6 to 10 song sequence became a norm for any early Indian talkie. It became a mandate for Indian films, which is still being practiced even today, even in context of contemporary Indian cinema. Also, the camera used during this particular period, which is Michel camera, something which I have already mentioned, I think, in the previous episode, was imported from US. And these were heavy cameras, which, and it was very difficult to lift these cameras from one position to another. Now, as a result, something interesting happened. The trend which started following was basically long takes. What happens with longer takes is that you do not have to move your camera so much during the shoot. In fact, Veerchand Dharamse, in an account of Alamara, states how an American sound expert, that is Deming, became extremely irritated as Alamara had excessively long takes. Also, using long takes became one, in one way it became mandatory because of the constraint with the arrival of sound, the technological constraint with the arrival of sound. But it also, the manner in which films were shot became to a certain extent theatrical, where actors kind of entered and exited the frame. And the mannerism was very similar to a theatrical play. This was also required due to constraint of microphones and the lack of training in the audio recording techniques, which was still not extremely popular in context of Indian cinema. Also, with the arrival of talkies, the business model of Indian cinema changed in many ways. Now, arrival of talkies led to slow dying down of certain individual enterprises and establishment. This was simply because that many of the individual enterprises could not afford the technological imperatives which were required with the arrival of talkies. Hence, the industry started following the Hollywood-based studio model of cinema. Now, what is exactly this Hollywood-based studio model of cinema? This is primarily, that is, the kind of film production which was followed in Hollywood during 1920s and 30s, that is the Hollywood studio system. It had stark similarities to the same. Now, the workforce, in context of the studio system, the workforce like the technician, actors, anybody and everybody, including the actors that is working in the production, were all salaried and contracted employees. And in accordance to the Hollywood counterpart, each studio also that is each Indian studio also started producing a particular genre of films. However, I would also like to make a note that there was a difference between the Hollywood studio system and the Indian studio system. It's because the exhibition circuit was often outside the clasp of a particular studio in context of Indian cinema. The integration, that is the fact that under one studio the production, distribution and exhibition, so all three circuits were part of under one studio. This is the Hollywood model. However, in context of the Indian film industry, the exhibition circuit was often outside the bounds of a particular studio. This is not true for all studios, but most of the studios. Also, each studio was equipped with its own studio, a considerable number of sound stages, film laboratories, as well as number of cameras and other film equipment. This kind of gave a greater flexibility to the then existing cameraman and technicians, resulting in better aesthetic quality of the film. In fact, this was also a mechanism in order to combat the risk management. That is, when one studio is making, say, supposedly 10 films with their salaried employees, then the losses of one film can be gained or recovered from the profits from another film. So it was also a risk management mechanism. However, the point I'm trying to make is that the entire system was very similar to the Hollywood studio model, where employees, everyone and anyone related to the particular production, were actually contracted and salaried employees by these studios. Now, let's talk about the studio era of Indian cinema. Prior to World War II, Indian cinema was often known to operate as the studio system or the studio era of Indian cinema. The studios, in fact, dominated Indian film industry during 1930s to as late as 1950s, and it functioned under the one big family principle. Now, let's talk about the 4 most important studios which were operating in India at that point of time. That is, with the arrival of studios or the formation of studios in India. Number 1, Imperial Film Company in Bombay, Prabhat Film Company in Pune, New Theatres in Calcutta, and Bombay Talkies. Let's talk about them one by one. Imperial Film Company in Bombay. Now, Imperial Film Company was established in 1926 and was functioning until 1938. Imperial Film was organized as a vertically integrated concern. Now, what do I mean by a vertically integrated concern? Where the production, distribution and exhibition is all of these stages are actually handled by the same studio. So it was a vertically integrated organization. In fact, it had its own exhibitions infrastructure as well, which was uncommon during those days. Imperial Film Company was often associated with costume historical genre. In fact, as I have already mentioned, Imperial came up with one of India's first talkie, Alamara. In 1929, it became the first studio in India to actually shoot scenes at night using incandescent lamps, because you have to understand that this is also the point of time when the technology is coming to India, and filmmakers are constantly experimenting with the technology. Now, it's also known, so Imperial Film Company, in fact, was also known for producing the first indigenously color processed film, Kisan Kanya, that is, Farmer's Daughter, as early as 1937. Imperial also produced the first Farsi language sound feature film in 1933, Dukhtare Lur, and thus an aspect of Iranian film history can be traced to Bombay. Second, Prabhat Film Company, based in Pune. Now, Prabhat, it's interesting because before I go on to this particular studio, the campus of Prabhat Film Company is now, it operates as the famous FTII campus, that is Film and Television Institute of India. Prabhat Film Company was established in 1929 in Kolhapur as a partnership between 5 people: Vishnupant Damle, S. Fathelal, V. Shantaram, K. Daibhar, and S. Kulkarni, together in 1929 founded Prabhat Film Company. The company moved to Pune, that is 170 kilometers from Bombay, in 1933, where it became Western India's premier studio with a national reputation. Prabhat actually had many stars on its payroll: its own processing lab, a well-equipped sound studio, editing departments, and the largest stage floor in India, and an art department which was regarded as the country's finest. Its style of filmmaking was influenced, obviously, it was based in Pune, so its style of filmmaking was influenced by the Marathi musical theatre, which is commonly referred as Sangeet Natak. In terms of subject, it explored mythological, devotional subject as well as several social themes. Ayodhya Che Raja, that is Ayodhya Ka Raja, 1932, was a film based on the truth-loving King Harishchandra. Amrit Manthan, 1934, another film by Prabhat Film Company, was a film about human and animal sacrifice as a backdrop. Amar Jyoti, on the other hand, interestingly, was a pro-feminist tale of a woman turning into a pirate and declaring war on the state when she was denied legal custody of her son. Prabhat's success was due to good distribution arrangements and long-term contract with the exhibitors. It eventually took on distribution itself and built its own theatre in Bombay, Pune and Madras, which means that it went on to exhibition as well. Prabhat lost its premier director, one of the premier director of Prabhat Film Company, Shantaram, in 1942, when he broke away to form his own studio in Bombay. And though it produced films after his departure, the studio was finally closed down in 1953. So Shantaram actually played a major role in Prabhat Film Company. However, Prabhat's greatest cinematic achievement, that is, in terms of the film, was Damle Fatehlal's Sant Tukaram. Sant Tukaram, 1936, was a biopic of a 17th century Maharashtrian saint.
आमचं ते येडं पांडुरंग म्हणी पांडुरंग धानी आगला ते तुमच्या पांड्याला चला म्हणजे महिना झाला घरात पोर माशावानी तडफडतंय त्याचं काय आहे का तुमच्या जीवाला धानी पांडुरंग म्हणी घ्या या करत्याला
तो आजारी आहे
होय होय तेच मागापासून तुमच्या मोहर वरडतो या त्याला का वसत विसत करायचं आहे का नाही.
This film was particularly remarkable because it was a triumph in all aspects, or you can say in all departments of filmmaking. And it also boasts of two extremely remarkable performances, as you just saw in the clip. One by Vishnupant Pagnis as Tukaram, the saint, and Gauri as the earthly and practical wife Jijai. The studio, that is Prabhat Film Company, thus pioneered in this particular genre, which is often recounted as saint films, biographical films about popular poet saints from the 16th and 17th century. Next, we come to New Theatre, based in our very own Calcutta. One of the key regional studio, New Theatre of Calcutta, was characterized by its elite members. So it was often known from the very beginning as an elite studio, simply because its production, the kind of films it was making or the kind of stories it was trying to tell, primarily drew heavily from literature. Founded by B.N. Sarkar, it was later joined by prominent figures like Devki Bose, Dhiren Ganguly, as well as P.C. Barua. Several key figures central to Hindi film industry, including Bimal Roy, Nitin Bose, Rishikesh Mukherjee, also began their career in New Theatre. Now, unlike Imperial or Prabhat, which produced silent films prior to the changeover to sound, New Theatre, as a production house from its very inception, was a sound studio. Many of its films were based on Bengali novels, and the studio often aimed at cinematic equivalent of the literature. It invested also considerably in technological innovation. And the techniques of playback singing was first introduced in a New Theatre film, Dhoop Chhao, in 1935. One of the most significant film, that is Devdas, made in both Hindi and Bengali in 1935, also came from New Theatre studio. Some of the other noteworthy work of New Theatre were Dena Pauna in 1931, Chandidas in 1932, Masto To Bhai in 1933, and Kopal Kundola in 1933. In 1932, on occasion of the 70th birth anniversary of Tagore, New Theatre also arranged a filming of Tagore's Natir Puja, an adaptation of his poem Pujarini. Now, let's talk about the studio Bombay Talkies. Bombay Talkies was one of the largest pre-World War II sound studio in India and introduced some of the major stars and directors, very popular ones, of Hindi film industry. Stars such as Devanand, Raj Kapoor, Ashok Kumar and Dilip Kumar. Founded by Himanshu Rai after his return from Europe in 1934, it was the only major studio established as a full-fledged corporate body. So unlike Imperial or Prabhat or New Theatre, Bombay Talkies operate in a corporate structure. Rai, that is Himanshu Rai, also had been involved in several Indo-German co-production during the silent era. And many of the studio's early technical team, that is director, cameraman, set designer, etc., were often imported from Germany. In fact, Bombay Talkies' early success from 1936 to 39 were directed by a German director, Franz Osten. After Himanshu Rai's death, his wife became the main star of the studio and took over the entire production. Now, the studio produced one of the biggest hit of pre-independence era, Kismat, in 1943, a crime thriller about a pickpocket being united with his long-lost family. Some of the other landmark films of Bombay Talkies are Achut Kanya, Ziddi and Mahal. However, studios were short-lived and after a point of time, the studio system in India declined. One reason for the same was the rise of the independent values of stars. And second, the influx of black money into the film industry post World War II. Now, number one, that is the rise of the independent values of stars. That is, that later what happened was that the payment offered to these stars were increased tenfold in form of unaccounted money, that is often black money. As a result, the stars became the most important commodity in the entire production, right from the investment to distribution. So, stars basically became the most important factor throughout the entire chain of film production. This led to a new system, which is often referred, once the studios declined, this new system of Indian cinema is known as star system. Now, as a result of it, since now the stars were not operating as salaried employees, there was an increasing cost in the rise of production, as they had to be paid an enormous amount. As a result, by 1950s, the studio era of Indian cinema had to end, had to in a certain way end, also with the influx of large number of producers into the very industry. A characteristics which dominated the Indian film industry for a long time to come. The second reason was also the outbreak of the World War II, which led to massive shortage of the film stock. Limitation of the raw stock led to decline of number of films, even made by established studios. See, the problem is that in studio system, if you do not have, if you do not make 8 to 10 films, say in a certain year, or if you do not have a regular flow of films, it becomes very difficult for the said studio to operate because everybody is working as salaried employees. It's like an organization will fail if it does not, if it cannot give a regular flow of film. That is what was happening with the shortage of raw stock. Since the adequate number of films were not being produced by a particular studio, the entire way the system operated as an organization kind of had to figure out new ways of operation.